Reacting to the formal title of Your Highness, the dark-haired Quill mutters in disbelief, asking if this is some kind of joke. A blonde nobleman cheerfully presents a document appointing Quill Langbart as fiancé to Saintess Lynetta Lees, insisting it is no joke. The man points directly at him, officially declaring Quill's new status with unshakable confidence. Quill stares back in absolute, stunned silence at being chosen as the Saintess's fiancé. An establishing shot reveals a magnificent, sprawling castle nestled securely against a grand mountainous backdrop. A delicate hand rests gently upon a handwritten document, hinting at quiet contemplation. Two elegantly dressed women sit closely together on a grand sofa, remarking on how long it has been since they shared such a moment. Saintess Lynetta Lees smiles warmly while glancing over the pages of her reading material. A graceful finger gently traces down the side of an elegant cup. Lynetta closes her eyes peacefully while holding a small, leather-bound notebook. The other woman earnestly states that this very moment is exactly what she desires. The two women clasp their hands together tightly in a firm, affectionate gesture. Lynetta looks at her companion with absolute sincerity, promising that she will surely grant her wish. Lynetta parts her lips slightly, her expression softening as she prepares to speak further. Smiling radiantly, Lynetta expresses her deep appreciation and thanks her friend. Noticing a subtle shift, the other woman hesitates and asks Lynetta if she is not smiling properly. A close-up captures Lynetta's attentive and slightly surprised profile. Reassuring her quickly, the companion tells Lynetta that she is doing very well. An opulent ballroom bustles with elegantly dressed nobles mingling beneath massive, glowing chandeliers. Waiters navigate through the crowded, chattering aristocracy with trays full of drinks. A focused waiter carefully carries a heavy tray of champagne flutes through the throng of guests. Suddenly, an oblivious Quill steps backward, bumping directly into the approaching waiter. The waiter gasps in shock as he tries to excuse himself from the unexpected collision. A sharp close-up on Quill's striking eye captures his sudden realization of the impending disaster. The momentum of the bump shifts the heavy tray entirely off balance. Glasses begin to tip over dangerously as gravity takes hold of the doomed tray. Champagne splashes wildly inside the tilting flutes just seconds before disaster strikes. Shattering violently onto the floor, the glasses erupt into a chaotic mess of flying shards. As the waiter offers his deepest apologies, Quill whirls around to ask if the man is all right. A nearby guest abruptly points out the commotion, drawing the entire room's attention to Quill. Cruel whispers immediately ripple through the crowd about the ominous red eyes of the Betzeraft. Noblewomen gossip maliciously about his strange taste, comparing his eyes to the color of blood. Furious, Quill glares back sharply, his piercing gaze cutting through their hateful whispers. The gossiping ladies instantly flinch in pure terror under his intense, intimidating scrutiny. The heavy impact of his glare completely silences the immediate area in an instant. Panic sets in as guests urgently warn each other to avoid making eye contact lest they be cursed. Letting out an exhausted sigh, Quill closes his eyes in weary resignation to the room's prejudice. Regaining his composure, Quill hands the waiter a cloth and promises to call someone to clean this up. Walking briskly through the halls away from the party, he is suddenly halted by an attendant calling out to Lord Quill Langbart. The attendant hands him a pressing message from Crown Prince Leonalt that demands his immediate attention. Opening a mysterious summons, the dark-haired knight reads a directive commanding him to leave the evening party early and report to the office. Puzzled by the sudden order, he wonders aloud what on earth this abrupt meeting could possibly be about. Stepping into the dimly lit royal office, he approaches the desk with a look of cautious anticipation. Crown Prince Leonalt firmly hands him a stamped document officially appointing Quill Langbart as the fiancé to Saintess Lynetta Lees. Utterly bewildered by the parchment, Quill asks His Highness if this absurd declaration is some kind of joke. Dismissing the doubt, Leonalt points out the official seal and asks if it looks forged to him. Pushing back against the mandate, Quill argues that the Saintess's spouse must be a royal possessing the second succession right or a direct relative. Leonalt smoothly counters that the second in line, his cute Felix, is only an 8-year-old angel. He further dismantles the options by noting that the third in line, Duke Brockmeyer, is 35, while Duke Eichberg is 41 and already married. Feeling backed into a corner, Quill urgently exclaims the Crown Prince's title in sheer disbelief. Frustrated by the logic, Quill insists there is no need to remove Lord Felix from the candidates and admits he does not follow this reasoning at all. Tapping his desk methodically, Leonault reveals that loud protests have recently erupted from the common people. He explains the public finds forcing an 18-year-old into a marriage with a massive age gap purely for bloodlines completely old-fashioned. Baffled by his own inclusion, Quill questions why his name came up since he is 25 himself and hardly close in age to the SAINTESS. Leaning forward with absolute certainty, the Crown Prince drops the bombshell that the SAINTESS personally chose him. Struck speechless, Quill freezes in place as the sheer weight of that revelation washes over him. Leonault elaborates that they decided to let her choose for herself, directly asking whom she wished to be bound to. Trying to maintain his composure, Quill begins to object with all due respect to His Highness. He brings up a massive flaw in the story, reminding the royal that the SAINTESS does not actually possess any emotions. Nodding calmly, Leonault confirms that despite her condition, the one she deliberately chose turned out to be Quill. Unable to think of a single logical reason, Quill desperately insists that her clear declaration must surely be a mistake. Leonault agrees that the current SAINTESS, much like her predecessors, has entirely lost all joy, anger, sorrow, and pleasure. Despite her emotionless state, he quotes her exact demand for a black-haired black knight possessing amber eyes. Hearing the physical description, Quill mutters the word amber to himself in profound confusion. Looking up with a sudden realization, he urgently calls out to His Highness once again. Quill boldly states that there must be a mistake because his eyes are definitively not amber, though Leonault claims he checked. A sharp, extreme close-up focuses intensely on Quill's striking, deeply red right eye. Unfazed by the visual evidence, Leonault casually brushes off the discrepancy by remarking that it seems so. Sweat dropping at the royal's blatant disregard for facts, Quill exasperatedly reiterates that his eyes are still not amber. Letting out a deep, exhausted sigh, Leonault speaks Quill's name with a tone of serious finality. Startled by the sudden shift in demeanor, Quill flinches back as the prince prepares his ultimate bargaining chip. Playing to the knight's weaknesses, Leonault promises that finalizing this engagement will permanently free him from annoying marriage proposals. Sweetening the deal even further, he suggests that Quill might never be invited to tedious evening parties ever again. Leonault slyly mentions that Lars told him a long time ago about Quill's constant complaining regarding those social events. Haunted by memories of nobles whispering about his fallen nation's blood with contempt, Quill internally screams that he still refuses to attend them. Smirking knowingly, Leonault asks how tonight's party was, prompting Quill to yell out his title in sheer frustration. Completely defeated by the undeniable perks, a miserable Quill finally caves and formally accepts the royal appointment. An expansive establishing shot reveals the majestic, sprawling architecture defining the prosperous kingdom of Ikrant. Ancient lore dictates that this mighty nation remains eternally protected by the divine blessing of the SAINTESS and her holy sword. To continuously spread this sacred power, she must carry the holy sword on a grueling 2-year pilgrimage across the temples of the north, south, east, and west. Chosen by the stars at 16, the SAINTESS wields the holy sword to obliterate magical beasts that constantly threaten her people. To activate this powerful divine blessing, the holy sword tragically feeds upon the very emotions of the SAINTESS herself. Returning from her grueling pilgrimage as a lifeless vessel, she loses all traces of emotion the moment she departs the northern temple. A massive crowd erupts into triumphant cheers as word fiercely spreads that the revered SAINTESS has finally returned. Gliding majestically through the bustling streets, an ornate carriage carries the kingdom's divine protector back to her people. The heavy carriage door swings open to reveal the delicate, silent figure stepping out before the eager masses. A finely dressed attendant respectfully offers his hand and urges Lady SAINTESS to reveal herself to the adoring public. Overjoyed citizens shower her with praise, loudly thanking the breathtakingly beautiful lady for her invaluable service to the kingdom. Relief completely washes over the grateful onlookers as they collectively sigh that they can finally rest easy now. Breaking the spell of pure adoration, a nervous child suddenly cowers and whispers that the mysterious lady looks utterly terrifying. Watching the grand spectacle from a distance, Quill observes the emotionless heroine with a heavy, calculating gaze. Doubting his own sudden engagement, he firmly assumes there must be some mistake and expects her to instantly reject him. Staring intensely through the roaring crowds, he grimly acknowledges that the hollow figure standing before them is meant to be his fiancée. Lowering his eyes, the dark-haired knight deeply contemplates the absolute absurdity of being bound to an empty shell. Welcoming the prospect of rejection, He reasons that a broken engagement with her would permanently end any future marriage proposals. Shaking off his spiraling thoughts, he firmly decides there is absolutely no point in worrying about things he does not yet know. Shifting his focus to duty, he recalls the strict tradition of giving a covenant lock for an engagement rather than a standard marriage ring. Muttering the unfamiliar term to himself, Quill urgently realizes he must somehow acquire and present a proper covenant lock. Wandering aimlessly through his thoughts, he struggles to figure out exactly how to go about procuring such a vital ceremonial item. Startled completely out of his mind by a sudden voice, Quill jolts backward as he comes face to face with Zasha. Smirking at Quill's negligence, the captain casually dismisses his own slacking while playfully teasing his jumpy friend. Leaning in with burning curiosity, Zasha directly questions why Quill is suddenly obsessing over an engagement proposal. Stunned that the infamous, impregnable ice wall is getting hitched, Zasha listens in sheer disbelief as Quill explains the matter is already decided. A look of total, unadulterated shock wildly washes over Zasha's face as the sheer weight of the sudden revelation registers. Desperate for any assistance, Quill aggressively leans into Zasha and begs for his expertise since he has zero clue what to choose. Panicking for details, Zasha demands to know who the unlucky girl is before Quill bluntly reveals it is Lady Lynetta Lees herself. Zasha instantly freezes in place like a solid statue, his mind completely short-circuiting at the mere mention of the kingdom's holy protector. Sweating profusely, Zasha nervously questions if he just stumbled upon a massive state secret that could get him killed. Shrugging off the panic, Quill notes it will be public knowledge soon anyway and shoots Zasha a terrifying glare to prevent rumors. Swallowing hard under the intense pressure, Zasha quickly agrees to keep his mouth shut before scrambling to gather his scattered thoughts. Pumping his fist with newfound determination, Zasha loudly declares that it is officially time to live up to his friend's heavy trust. Slipping into expert mode, Zasha explains that covenant locks follow seasonal trends like lucky symbols or specific floral decorations. Pointing his finger knowingly, he reveals the hottest current trend involves lining up two glowing stones matching the eye colors of both partners. Looking down thoughtfully, Quill quietly murmurs about eye colors as he considers how to properly represent his own cursed gaze. Offering a rare smile of warm encouragement, Zasha gives the highly personalized gemstone idea his absolute seal of approval. Reminding him that Lady Lynetta just returned, Zasha advises Quill to take his time deciding while she remains deeply busy with royal duties. Nodding firmly in agreement, Quill fully accepts the sound advice and decides to carefully plan his next move before they officially meet. One full month passes in an absolute flash as the scene dramatically shifts to the imposing gates of the Mangaart family townhouse. A grand, horse-drawn carriage steadily pulls up to the quiet estate, marking a sudden disruption to Quill's peaceful, secluded isolation. Stepping lightly onto the stone path, a mysterious figure notes that it has been quite some time since they last returned here. A grand establishing shot captures the imposing exterior of the majestic Mangaart family estate in the quiet afternoon. Spotting the dark-haired knight arriving, Nicola loudly exclaims his total relief that Quill is finally back. Sprinting frantically toward his master, Nicola breathlessly demands to know why he is returning so incredibly late. Catching his breath, Quill simply turns his head to react to his servant's sudden and loud commotion. Completely horrified, Nicola screams in disbelief that Quill is somehow still wearing his official knight uniform. Shrugging off the intense panic, Quill calmly reminds his frantic servant that he is naturally an active knight. Flailing wildly, Nicola berates his master for being totally oblivious on the monumental day he welcomes his new fiancée. Defending himself quickly, Quill insists he is not actually dirty since he skillfully avoided any messy subjugation missions today. Letting out an exhausted sigh, Nicola realizes that arguing any further with the dense knight is completely pointless. Rushing him inside, Nicola insists they cannot keep the Saintess waiting as Quill questions why they aren't heading downstairs. Gesturing dramatically, Nicola forcefully reminds Quill that the Saintess will actually be living in the newly prepared room upstairs. Processing the heavy reality, Quill mutters a quick apology as the logic of the living arrangements finally clicks. Rubbing his temples in absolute distress, Nicola begs his master to start acting like a proper and reliable fiancé. Walking down the ornate hallway, Quill internally admits he must act properly despite the situation feeling entirely surreal. Mentally plotting his tight schedule, Quill plans to finalize the engagement over dinner before quickly retreating back to the barracks. Guiding him respectfully down the grand corridor, Nicola gestures formally toward a highly decorated wooden door. Stopping dead in his tracks, Quill softly mutters the heavy word fiancé as the sheer gravity of it suddenly sets in. Stealing his nerves, the dark-haired knight prepares to finally face his newly appointed destiny waiting behind the door. Glancing around in pure confusion, Quill foolishly asks his servant if they have somehow arrived at his own room. Clenching his fists in sheer annoyance, Nicola fiercely reiterates that this is actually the Saintess's designated chamber. Pointedly gesturing down the hall, the frustrated servant clarifies that Quill's personal chambers are situated right next door. Knocking politely on the heavy wood, Nicola loudly announces to Lady Lees that Lord Quill has formally arrived. A sudden, heavy thud violently echoes from within the silent room, immediately shattering the tense anticipation. A delicate teacup shatters loudly against the floorboards as a puddle of water quickly spreads across the wood. Apologizing softly from behind the door, Lynetta nervously asks for a disposable cloth to wipe up the sudden mess. Instantly concerned by the chaotic commotion, Nicola urgently asks through the door if something is terribly wrong inside. Pushing past all formal pleasantries, Quill decisively grabs the brass handle and throws the heavy door wide open. Stepping boldly into the private chambers, Quill quickly excuses his sudden intrusion to accurately assess the unfolding situation. Scanning the elegant room, his piercing gaze immediately locks onto the unfortunate spill staining the pristine floorboards. Kneeling gracefully on the damp floor, the stunning Saintess attempts to hastily clean the mess with her bare hands. Her breathtakingly beautiful face tilts upward, locking her supposedly empty gaze directly onto the imposing, intruding knight. Frozen entirely in place, Quill stares down in complete, breathless awe at the impossibly radiant woman resting before him. Breaking the incredibly heavy silence, Quill hesitantly murmurs her holy title into the quiet, tension-filled room. Her striking eyes widen drastically as she fully takes in the towering, dark-haired knight standing solidly in her doorway. Without warning, heavy tears suddenly begin welling up violently within the Saintess's famously emotionless and hollow eyes. Huge, glistening teardrops instantly cascade silently down her delicate cheeks in absolute defiance of her tragic curse. Gripping her chest tightly, the supposedly lifeless Saintess breaks down into a sudden, overwhelming bout of genuine weeping. Shifting abruptly to a grand historical tapestry, the narrative violently recounts an inevitable conflict sparking with a neighboring superpower. Fiercely absorbing every surrounding kingdom in its path, the ancient empire of Ekelsen aggressively expanded its sprawling territories. Forging a brand new legacy from pure blood, the mighty nation of Eikrant officially rose from the fallen ashes of Ekelsen. A burning flag flutters intensely in the wind amid the chaotic wreckage of a desolate battlefield. Plunging into a violent historical flashback, a fierce conflict ruthlessly rages during the midst of a certain war. Harnessing an ancient magic called sorcery, the people of Betzeraft possessed the terrifying power to command magical beasts. Utilizing this forbidden sorcery, the king of Ringdell launched a devastating surprise attack on the nation of Ekelsen. Unleashing a massive swarm of nearly 100 magical beasts, they deployed sorcery that was supposed to be completely exclusive to Betzeraft. Shocked by the brutal betrayal, the besieged people angrily questioned if the people of Betzeraft had secretly lent their aid to Ringdell. Driven entirely by deep-seated suspicion, the citizens aggressively persecuted the people of Betzeraft as countless lives were tragically lost. Recognizing their crucial achievement in the conflict, the pragmatic king of Ekelsen left the murky relationship between Betzeraft and Ringdell unquestioned. Using the remaining Betzeraft power to counter Ringdell, the king of Ekelsen realized that only sorcery could oppose sorcery to finally win the long war. Haunting the present day, profound suspicion toward Betzeraft remains deeply rooted even now within the kingdom of Eikrant. Bearing the physical marks of their heritage, these outcasts possessed pitch-black hair and striking dark red eyes resembling the color of blood. Coupled with their highly unusual appearance, the persecuted people of Betzeraft are cruelly branded as having defiled blood by certain prejudiced individuals. Shifting abruptly back to the present, a tense and heavy silence fills the destroyed room as Lynetta gazes up at the towering knight. Staring down in utter disbelief, Quill watches helplessly as genuine, heavy tears stream violently down the Saintess's supposedly emotionless face. Screaming in sudden panic, an attendant rushes in to check on Lady Saintess as Lynetta clutches her profusely bleeding hand. Barking orders urgently, Lynetta commands the frantic servant to immediately prepare medical supplies for her fresh injury. Reaching out gently, Quill leans forward with deep, undeniable concern etched across his usually stoic features. Asking softly for permission, the dark-haired knight politely requests to touch her wounded, bloodied hand. Looking up with wide, tear-filled eyes, the weeping saintess quietly observes the towering man offering his unexpected assistance. Gripping her delicate wrist firmly yet carefully, Quill takes her injured hand directly into his own to inspect the damage. Expressing her sincere gratitude, Lynetta warmly thanks him and states that she deeply appreciates his gentle help. Peering closely at her breathtakingly beautiful face, Quill becomes absolutely mesmerized by the sorrowful, captivating depth of her tearful eyes. Getting entirely lost in her striking gaze, he internally marvels at the deep blue color that feels like it could effortlessly draw him in. Breaking the tense silence, Quill finally speaks up and formally asks if he presumes correctly that she is Lady Lynetta Lees. Closing her eyes gracefully, the saintess regains her composure while still tightly gripping her injured, bloody palm. Confirming his assumption effortlessly, she states that there is absolutely no mistake and it is likely fine now. Calling him Lord Quill, she asks him warmly who else it could possibly be but her in this specific room. Startled by her surprisingly casual and friendly demeanor, a visible question mark pops over Quill's utterly confused face. Staring down at her freshly bandaged hand, Lynetta quietly inspects the bloody white cloth wrapped tightly around her palm. Holding up her injured hand gracefully, the saintess prepares to explain the dark, twisted truth behind her sudden bleeding. Revealing the horrifying reality, she bluntly confesses that she was merely checking if the open wound would heal properly on its own. Shocked by her reckless and insane behavior, Quill's eyes widen drastically as the horrific implication of her words fully sets in. Explaining her twisted logic, she notes that a wound of this degree would previously close immediately, but she wondered what would happen now that the pilgrimage is over. Horrified by the casual revelation, Quill urgently demands to know if this bloody mess is truly a self-inflicted wound because it would cause trouble for House Langbart. Bowing her head slightly in shame, Lynetta offers her deepest apologies for thoughtlessly soiling the pristine wooden floor. Dismissing the spilled tea entirely, Quill insists that such trivial things do not matter as he frantically processes the former saintess's actions. Staring intensely at the weeping woman, he silently observes the former saintess as a strange, overwhelming realization washes over him. Flashing a sudden, breathtakingly bright smile, Lynetta looks up at him with undeniable, radiant joy shining through her tears. Utterly blindsided by her rapidly shifting expressions, Quill's mind short-circuits as he loudly questions how she is possibly smiling right now. Turning her head away shyly, Lynetta quickly asks him to please excuse her highly impure display of chaotic, overwhelming emotions. Practicing her etiquette, the stoic young woman remarks that she is handling social situations quite well. Lord Quill simply agrees with her assessment as they stand together in the quiet room. Offering a polite smile, she acknowledges that this expression serves as her primary social interaction since he intends to avoid public gatherings. Caught off guard, Quill stares back in brief silence as her words sink in. Maintaining her composure, she admits that constantly interacting with an emotionless doll would be rather depressing. Quill's expression remains unreadable as he absorbs her blunt observation. A memory suddenly flashes of an enthusiastic noble loudly greeting Lord Quill Langbart. The memory quickly sours as the same individual cruelly mocks his savage color. Brought abruptly back to the present, Quill looks utterly overwhelmed by a towering mountain of paperwork. Exhaustion bleeds into his eyes as the frustrating cycle repeats itself once again. He remains completely silent while processing the heavy burden of their arranged dynamic. Breaking the quiet, Quill finally asks if she finds it depressing to force such a fake smile. Meeting his gaze, she explains that while she can still feel discomfort, she has no spirit left to truly feel depressed. Her hollow yet resolute demeanor perfectly embodies the identity of Lady Lynetta Lees Murray. Guilt quietly gnaws at Quill as he wonders if he is going to let all her earnest practice go to waste. Deciding to act, he formally presents her with a covenant lock resting securely inside a decorative box. Lynetta's wide eyes stare intently at the meaningful artifact offered to her. Without hesitation, she extends her arm toward Quill so he can easily place the item on her wrist. She instructs him directly, stating that she believes he is supposed to secure it on her in this manner. Closing his eyes in quiet resignation, Quill confirms that he heard the exact same instructions. With careful precision, his gloved hands gently tie the braided cords of the covenant lock around her slender wrist. The unique bracelet now sits perfectly secured against her pale skin. Examining the accessory, Lynetta softly notes the vibrant blue stone embedded in its center. She reveals that His Highness told her the stone was chosen specifically to match the blue of Quill's eyes. Clasping her hands behind her back, she accepts the romantic gesture with a calm demeanor. Looking up at him, she officially declares their engagement established with this formal binding. Quill accepts her declaration with a simple nod, coldly confirming that their business is concluded. The newly engaged couple stands frozen in a stretch of intensely comfortable silence. A sudden clatter completely shatters the tranquil atmosphere surrounding them. Nicola the maid bursts into the room in an absolute panic, desperately asking Lord Quill about a wound. Her genuine concern instantly turns to furious horror as she spots the covenant lock, screaming that he gave her a cheap-looking accessory. Flustered by the sudden attack, Quill weakly argues that wasting money on grandiose items for an already established engagement is unnecessary. Utterly defeated, Quill finds himself kneeling helplessly in the hallway as the heavy door is slammed in his face. From behind the closed door, Nicola fiercely orders him to go cool his head and think about a woman's feelings. Pinching his nose in deep exasperation, Quill silently absorbs the humiliating reprimand. Standing alone, he mentally kicks himself for missing the chance to tell Lynetta that the harsh treatment wasn't necessary. The gloomy mood abruptly breaks when a cheerful young girl runs up to welcome him home. His energetic sister Adele beams brightly as she warmly greets her older brother. An older gentleman steps up beside Adele, warmly welcoming Quill back after a long time away. The man notes that Quill seems entirely unchanged, a casual observation that Quill readily agrees with. Dismissing the lingering tension, Quill calmly explains to his family that Nicola merely scolded him for his poor choice of covenant lock. Sighing heavily, Adele suspects he treated the meaningful gesture as a mere formality and easily imagines exactly what kind of cheap lock he procured. Shifting the topic, she asks if something else happened, noting how visibly flustered Nicola looked while running past Lord Lars. The heavy word, connection, visually echoes in the empty space as the siblings delve into Lynetta's mysterious background. Frustrated by the sudden secrecy, Adele insists her brother absolutely should have told her if he already had a personal connection with the Lady Saintess. Looking away thoughtfully, Quill slowly repeats the loaded word as he processes the utterly unexpected and confusing rumor. Breaking down the rigid political divide, he explains that the old-fashioned Carey's family shares absolutely no common ground with his own emerging house. He logically adds that since her prestigious family guards the Saintess, any prior connection she made would surely be with a white knight rather than a black knight. Staring blankly ahead, Quill frankly admits he has absolutely no memory of her and genuinely questions if she actually knows him. Rationalizing his growing doubts, he notes that if someone as strikingly beautiful as her had crossed his path, he surely would have remembered it. Dismissing the idea completely, he concludes it must be a massive mistake since he has no connection, acquaintance, or even a single clue about her identity. Adele enthusiastically declares she will personally check with Lynetta later, prompting a completely panicked Quill to firmly forbid the disastrous idea. Smiling warmly, Adele urges him to stop being so pessimistic and to build his confidence now that an accepting partner has finally appeared. Reaching out gently, she affectionately pats her older brother's arm to offer him some desperately needed emotional support. Visibly softened by the tender gesture, Quill warmly thanks his younger sister Audie for her unwavering comfort in the face of his anxiety. Blushing with a dramatic pout, Adele immediately scolds him to stop treating her like a little child. A rare, genuine smile breaks across Quill's scarred face as the light-hearted sibling banter briefly melts away his heavy gloom. Stepping into the conversation, their father assures Quill that if the arranged engagement truly feels impossible, they will devise an alternative plan together. Adele quickly interjects, fiercely warning her brother that breaking it off would deeply discourage their hopeful mother. Reassuring his anxious family, Quill firmly states he cannot break a royal command and risk spreading devastating trouble to Hilda's family. Solidifying his unwavering resolve, he confidently adds that Hilda would undoubtedly say the exact same thing if she were present. Their father gently places a comforting hand on Adele's shoulder, casually suggesting they head to the dining room to wait for the couple. Turning to leave with their father, Adele shoots one last deeply concerned glance back toward her stoic brother. Meeting her worried gaze, Quill offers a reassuring look and apologizes for making her fret, promising that everything will be completely fine. Left standing entirely alone in the dim corridor, Quill's expression instantly darkens as the crushing weight of his looming responsibilities settles back in. A grand, ornate clock ticks steadily in the quiet hallway as the designated time for their formal dinner rapidly approaches. Approaching Linetta's intricately carved chamber door, Quill raises his gloved hand and delivers a firm, polite knock. Announcing his arrival, Quill formally informs Lady Carries that he has come to safely escort her to the grand dining hall. Speaking softly from behind the heavy wood, Linetta politely asks Lord Quill to wait just a brief moment while she finishes preparing. Suddenly, the door cracks open to reveal a fiercely glaring Nicola, leaving Quill utterly confused by the unexpected hostility. The fiercely protective maid stares him down with intense suspicion, making it blatantly obvious she has not forgiven his earlier blunder with the gift. Maintaining her aggressively defensive stance, Nicola silently blocks his path and coldly assesses his true intentions toward her lady. Quill stands awkwardly in the dimly lit corridor, his massive, imposing figure sharply contrasting with his hesitant, deeply uncertain demeanor. Gazing down at the furious maid, he silently questions why he must constantly endure such intense scrutiny just to escort his own fiancée. A dark, traumatic memory suddenly aggressively invades his mind, echoing the cruel societal insults about his red eyes and defiled blood. The haunting flashback violently plunges him into an isolating void of endless societal judgment and inescapable despair. Completely overwhelmed by his deep-seated insecurities, he bitterly wonders why she chose him when countless better, untainted options existed. The heavy door finally swings fully open, snapping him back to reality as a breathtakingly dressed Linetta gracefully apologizes for the delay. Taking a remarkably elegant step forward, she politely excuses herself as she prepares to officially join him for the evening. Quill simply stares in absolute quiet awe as the undeniable beauty of his stunning fiancée completely takes his breath away. Staring in absolute awe at Linetta's stunning aesthetic transformation, Quill finds himself completely captivated by the unexpected elegance of her casual attire. Wondering aloud if her plain clothes are a bit too flashy for the occasion, Linetta humbly credits Nicola for creating the outfit, prompting Quill to instantly reassure her that it suits her perfectly. Blushing subtly under his earnest and unwavering gaze, Linetta softly lowers her eyes while deeply absorbing his sincere, gentle compliment. Breaking the brief but tender silence lingering between them, Quill quickly regains his knightly composure and formally offers to lead her down the sprawling corridor toward the grand dining room. Extending his heavily gloved hand with polite, guarded hesitation, he softly asks if she would do him the profound honor of taking his lead. Offering a remarkably tiny but undeniably genuine smile, Linetta gracefully accepts his chivalrous gesture and gently rests her delicate fingers squarely against his wide palm. Walking side by side in an entirely comfortable rhythm, the imposing Black Knight and the elegant lady seamlessly navigate their way down the lavishly decorated halls of the massive estate. Glancing sideways at her flawlessly stoic profile, Quill meticulously studies the subtle intricacies of her calm expression as a powerful, newfound curiosity stirs deep within his chest. Halting his purposeful steps abruptly in the middle of the corridor, Quill turns fully toward Linetta with an intensely serious demeanor that instantly demands her undivided attention. Seeking absolute clarity regarding their previous conversation, Quill carefully asks if her bold statement about still possessing the heart to feel genuine pleasure or discomfort remains fundamentally true. Caught slightly off guard by the sudden philosophical inquiry, Linetta quickly confirms it is true but dismissively notes that those fleeting feelings completely vanish in the mere 3 seconds it takes to count them out. Echoing her specific and tragic time frame, Quill thoughtfully repeats the phrase about counting to 3 as a daring, emotionally risky new idea takes root in his calculating mind. Gently lifting her delicate fingers with immense care, Quill slowly brings her hands significantly closer to his face in a display of sudden, uncharacteristic boldness. Gazing deeply into her vibrant eyes, he earnestly requests that she physically raise her hand within those crucial 3 seconds to immediately signal her true, unfiltered inner feelings. Pointing specifically to the vibrant blue stone resting securely on her wrist, he gently instructs her to raise her left hand holding the covenant lock whenever she experiences a spark of genuine pleasure. Emphasizing fiercely that there is absolutely no pressure to perform, he calmly adds that she should simply raise her right hand if she ever feels even the slightest hint of discomfort instead. Pleading with unwavering, desperate sincerity, Quill asks her to let him know her true heart within those 3 fleeting seconds before the fragile, beautiful emotions can completely vanish into the void. Looking deeply into her shimmering, wide eyes, he emotionally confesses that he would vastly prefer her honest, momentary reactions over any fabricated, forced smiles she might offer. Utterly stunned by his profound and unexpected empathy, Linetta's eyes widen dramatically as the heavy, comforting weight of his compassionate proposal effortlessly washes over her heavily fortified defensive walls. Staring blankly at him in utterly stunned silence, her traditionally rigid posture visibly softens as the undeniable sincerity of his heartfelt request slowly breaks through her deeply ingrained emotional conditioning. A vibrant, completely unmistakable blush floods her previously pale cheeks as she fully processes the highly intimate and deeply caring nature of his unexpectedly romantic gesture. Lowering her gaze sharply to hide her rapidly warming face, Linetta quietly absorbs the overwhelmingly powerful realization that someone truly values her authentic, unfiltered feelings. Raising her left hand directly toward her chest in a swift, decisive motion, Linetta softly calls out his name while firmly pressing the beautiful covenant lock near her fiercely beating heart. Meeting his intense, burning gaze with a powerful and newly forged resolve, she wordlessly communicates her profound, absolute acceptance of his unique emotional communication method. Swearing a binding, sacred oath upon the covenant mirror he previously gifted her, Linetta firmly promises that her signaling hand will never once deceive him in their ongoing dynamic. Stunned by her breathtakingly beautiful and resolute expression, Quill feels an immensely powerful surge of warmth rapidly expand within the confines of his own heavily guarded chest. Breaking the intense, emotionally charged spell lingering thickly between them, Quill finally nods in deep, quiet satisfaction and politely asks if they should officially proceed to their waiting dinner. Arriving safely at the bustling, brilliantly lit dining room, the newly bonded couple prepares to face his highly energetic family unit as a completely unified front. Gathering joyfully around the lavishly decorated mahogany table, the entire Mangaart family rapidly dives into a remarkably warm and cheerful meal filled with surprisingly pleasant, engaging conversation. Shocked to her core by an entirely unexpected childhood revelation, Adele loudly gasps in absolute disbelief after discovering that the flawlessly elegant Linetta actually used to recklessly climb trees. Smiling fondly at the highly nostalgic memory, Linetta readily confirms she was just like Adele at age 10 and casually mentions that she often tumbled painfully right out of those exact same branches. Bursting into a fit of joyous, echoing laughter, Adele excitedly declares a deep, instant sense of kinship with Linetta while teasingly calling her quite the impressive, adventurous tomboy. Leaning forward with a highly amused smirk plastered across his face, their father chuckles warmly as he notes that he can easily imagine Hilda displaying that exact same wild, uncontainable behavior. Observing the effortless, joyful banter continuously flowing around the grand table, Quill quietly wonders in silent isolation if he is genuinely the only person who doesn't perfectly fit into this lively family dynamic. Trying desperately to escape the overwhelming, suffocating social pressure, Quill abruptly announces his desire to return to the night barracks, prompting his fiercely protective father to quickly demand he stay at the mansion. Stammering weakly under his father's intensely imposing, unyielding glare, Quill visibly shrinks back in his chair and completely struggles to mount any form of a successful tactical defense. Pointing out his incredibly clear familial obligations, his father firmly argues that spending quality time with Lady Linetta is just as vitally important as his physically demanding night watch duties. Further cornering him with utterly flawless logistical logic, his mother strictly adds that commuting after a sudden, violent subjugation mission is dangerous, firmly insisting that he absolutely must stay for the night. Thoroughly defeated by his mother's brilliantly ironclad reasoning, a visibly sweating and panicking Quill silently surrenders to the combined, overwhelming and unstoppable force of his parents' strategic arguments. Leaning slightly toward the clearly exhausted and entirely defeated knight, Linetta softly asks if he will actually be staying for the day, to which a completely resigned Quill quickly and definitively denies the possibility. Beaming with bright enthusiasm, Adele happily announces to the family that she personally helped prepare tonight's special dessert. Continuing her joyful pitch, Adele excitedly points out that if Quill actually stays, the entire family, including her new sister-in-law, will finally eat breakfast together. Quill stares back in wide-eyed, silent shock as his energetic sister heavily emphasizes the concept of everyone being together. Observing the lively family dynamic from the sidelines, Linetta maintains a highly observant and intensely serious expression. Stepping forward with sudden resolve, Linetta firmly tells the family not to keep Quill here out of concern for her, declaring she absolutely must not hinder his crucial nightly duties. Turning her intense, unwavering gaze directly toward him, she formally urges Lord Quill to return safely to the night barracks tonight. Utterly caught off guard by her blunt dismissal, A visibly panicked Quill awkwardly stammers out a quick thanks for her time. Immediately realizing his massive tactical error, Quill frantically waves his hands and desperately tries to explain that an early departure is not what he actually meant. Reclaiming his composure, he firmly corrects his previous statement and definitively declares that he will return to his post tomorrow instead. Offering a surprisingly gentle, sympathetic smile, Lynetta quietly apologizes for accidentally overstepping her boundaries. Staring intently at her softened features, Quill softly whispers Lady Lynetta's name as a profound realization washes over him. Smiling warmly, Adele completely exposes her brother's social anxiety, playfully explaining that using Lynetta as a convenient excuse is the absolute truth since he rarely visits the mansion. Quill visibly sweats and aggressively avoids eye contact as his highly perceptive sister happily dismantles his defensive excuses in front of his new fiancée. Lynetta silently processes this surprising new piece of information with a perfectly blank, unreadable stare. Lowering her gaze thoughtfully, she deeply considers the undeniable fact that he actually chose to stay specifically because of her presence. Looking back up with slightly widened eyes, she quietly absorbs the touching reality of his unexpected, silent dedication. Shattering the lingering romantic tension, their father loudly claps his hands together and excitedly summons everyone to finally devour Addie's magnificent strawberry tort. Following her earlier promise, Lynetta subtly but firmly presses her left hand holding the covenant lock squarely against her chest to indicate a spark of genuine pleasure. Quill's eyes widen to absolute comical proportions as he immediately spots her deeply secretive, emotionally charged hand signal. Staring at her in pure, unadulterated astonishment, he realizes she is actively communicating her true, unfiltered feelings directly to him. A faint, beautifully genuine blush rapidly spreads across Lynetta's pale cheeks as she bravely maintains the highly intimate gesture. Completely paralyzed by the overwhelming sweetness of her honest reaction, Quill stares blankly ahead while his brain totally short-circuits. An explosive, fiercely bright blush aggressively overtakes his entire face as the powerful wave of pure emotion strikes him straight in the heart. Desperately throwing a heavily gloved hand over his fiercely burning face, Quill tries in vain to hide his massive embarrassment from his entirely oblivious family. Much later that evening, a thoroughly exhausted Quill trudges down the incredibly dark, quiet mansion corridor while letting out a heavy, defeated sigh. Dragging his incredibly heavy feet, the deeply drained Black Knight sluggishly navigates the familiar halls toward his designated sleeping quarters. Pausing abruptly in his sluggish tracks, Quill suddenly hears a strange, entirely unexpected sound breaking through the absolute silence of the grand estate. Standing directly outside his bedroom door, he desperately longs to collapse into his firm barracks bed just as a soft, rhythmic double knock suddenly echoes out. Jerking his head sharply toward the sound, Quill looks utterly bewildered by the prospect of receiving a late-night visitor. Pulling the heavy wooden door open, he is completely shocked to find an incredibly stoic Lynetta standing quietly in the dimly lit hallway. Staring down at his highly unexpected guest in the middle of the night, Quill calmly asks Lady Carys if something urgent is the matter. Lynetta looks up at his towering, imposing figure with an incredibly serious, utterly unreadable expression. Sensing her deep hesitation, Quill gently asks what is bothering her and thoughtfully wonders if it is simply too difficult to discuss openly in the exposed hallway. Nodding ever so slightly, Lynetta politely confirms his accurate suspicion and formally requests to speak with him inside his private chambers. Maintaining his flawless nightly composure, Quill simply agrees with a firm nod and politely steps aside to grant her immediate entry. Lynetta slowly and gracefully walks past his massive frame, fully entering the dimly lit, highly sparse bedroom. Quietly shutting the heavy wooden door completely behind her, Quill effectively seals them both inside the profoundly quiet, highly intimate space. Turning back to face his fiancée, Quill stands awkwardly near the closed door while nervously preparing for her supposedly urgent discussion. Gesturing vaguely toward the sparse room furniture, he politely offers her a seat but responsibly warns against staying too long since it is already incredibly late. Completely ignoring his polite offer, Lynetta immediately reaches up and decisively begins undoing the delicate collar of her dress, leaving a deeply flustered Quill entirely speechless. Breaking the heavy silence of the dimly lit room, the rustling fabric of Lynetta's dress signals a sudden shift in the atmosphere. Stuttering with uncharacteristic hesitation, Lynetta stumbles over her words as she struggles to articulate her highly unexpected intentions. Standing entirely frozen in the quiet bedroom, she braces herself to confidently deliver an incredibly bold proposition. Looking up with a flawlessly stoic expression, she formally announces that she has come for an intimate night visit. Struck by absolute, paralyzing panic, a flustered Quill immediately throws his hands up and desperately begs her to stop. Completely ignoring his frantic protests, she bluntly clarifies her intent to actively share his bed for the night. Utterly paralyzed by her shocking bluntness, Quill stares at his beautiful fiancée in wide-eyed, absolute disbelief. Regaining a mere fraction of his composure, he firmly reminds Miss Carys that such an intimate act is neither a duty nor an obligation. Tilting her head slightly, she calmly counters by mentioning she heard that active knights naturally possess notoriously vigorous appetites. Internally sweating bullets, Quill mentally panics over whether sending her away will irreparably wound her fragile noble pride. Pinching the bridge of his nose in deep exhaustion, he silently laments how this relentlessly restless day is finally coming to an end. The soft, highly provocative rustling of delicate fabric boldly echoes through the quiet space as Lynetta aggressively continues to disrobe. Slipping her elegant garment further down her pale shoulders, she relentlessly pushes forward with her heavily misguided, dutiful mission. Exposing her smooth skin to the cool night air, she willingly presents herself to the deeply overwhelmed Black Knight. Throwing his heavily gloved hands over his fiercely blushing face, Quill lets out a muffled, desperate shout of pure embarrassment. Desperately pleading with her to stop, he gently explains that while he doesn't dislike such things, he firmly believes they are completely unnecessary right now. Trying desperately to physically de-escalate the tension, he politely insists that if they have nothing else to discuss, this encounter is officially over. Refusing to back down from her perceived duty, Lynetta earnestly declares that she desperately wishes to properly repay him. Staring deeply into his eyes, she tragically confesses that she has absolutely nothing else to offer the man who graciously accepted this engagement. Her vibrant eyes shimmer with an intense, unwavering resolve as she prepares to completely sacrifice her own comfort for his supposed physical desires. A heavy wave of dark realization suddenly crashes over Quill as he fully processes her deeply flawed intention to literally repay him with her body. Gazing down at the highly vulnerable woman before him, he bitterly wonders if she truly thinks he is nothing more than some lust-driven beast. The intense, heavy silence swiftly returns as the imposing knight carefully studies his fiancée's incredibly guarded and rigid posture. Stepping slightly closer, Quill decides to completely shatter her painful misconception with a barrage of highly personal, deeply emotional questions. Calling out her name softly, he demands her absolute attention to ensure she understands the extreme gravity of his next words. Looking directly into her shimmering blue eyes, he seriously asks if she feels any genuine fear toward him at this exact moment. Without missing a single emotional beat, Lynetta firmly and honestly shakes her head to deny feeling any form of fear. Pressing further into her deeply suppressed emotional state, he solemnly asks if her heart races or if she feels a passionate heat rising within her body. Maintaining her flawlessly blank expression, she bluntly and instantly answers with a definitive, unyielding negative. Taking a remarkably gentle but firm tone, Quill warns her that if the heart does not actively accompany the physical act, the body will quickly begin to ache. Emphasizing the tragic, inescapable reality of forced intimacy, he softly adds that she would experience absolutely nothing but profound pain. Lynetta listens intently, her wide eyes reflecting a sudden spark of deep confusion regarding his surprisingly gentle, protective logic. Refusing to ever exploit her, he passionately argues that forcing the act would become endless suffering and a uniquely cruel, unbearable burden upon her. Absorbing his fiercely compassionate words, her rigid posture visibly falters under the immense, crushing weight of his unexpected kindness. Clutching her dress defensively, she stubbornly argues that as a nobleman's daughter, she can dutifully respond to physical requests even without harboring romantic feelings. Sighing heavily at her commendable but tragically self-destructive resolution, Quill points out that she essentially believes he would selfishly embrace her out of sheer, base desire. Cutting off her quick, flustered denial, he bitterly dismisses the insult, admitting he is already deeply accustomed to being viewed as a monstrous entity. Looking away with a dark, deeply self-deprecating glare, he frankly admits he still doesn't understand why she actually chose him in the first place. Advising her to quickly come to her senses, he harshly reminds her that he holds no grand title to inherit nor the peculiar, mighty power of his fallen kingdom. Stripping away all his own remaining pride, Quill bluntly and tragically declares that he is absolutely nothing more than an ordinary, entirely unremarkable leftover. Awakening in a dimly lit room, a pale, long-haired woman sits up in bed radiating an ethereal yet exhausted presence. Startled by a sudden movement in the shadows, an anxious maid gasps, "Ah!" in shock as she holds a flickering candle. Striding firmly away, a dark-haired man instructs the maid to escort Miss Carries to her room before declaring he will go cool his head for a while. Trailing closely behind the imposing man with a candle in hand, the obedient maid softly murmurs, "Yes," in nervous compliance. Silence completely overtakes the grand corridor as the dark-haired man and the trailing maid walk away from the dimly lit doorway. A dramatic close-up reveals a wide, intense eye as the name, Quill, resonates sharply within the narrative space. Surrounded by a lavish feast, a blushing young boy named Quill beams as joyous voices shout, "Congratulations," for his 12th birthday. Basking in the incredible warmth of the celebration, Quill smiles warmly as elegantly dressed attendees raise their glasses in his honor. Whispers of vicious doubt undercut the joyous mood as onlookers gossip about his father hailing from Ikrant and remark on his black hair. Sweating under the crushing weight of scrutiny, Quill's joyful demeanor falters as an imposing figure notes he is 12 already. The cruel voice mercilessly challenges the black-haired Betseraft boy, aggressively questioning if he can command magical beasts by now. Accused of fancying himself an Ikrant because of his amber eyes, Quill faces harsh prejudice while someone begs to retract the statement. A monstrous mouth aggressively screams over Quill, demanding the Betseraft control the beasts as the kingdom stands exposed without a saintess. The venomous verbal assault reaches a vicious climax as the voice questions if confronting the beasts is the only way a freeloader can repay them. Clenching his jaw with deep, overwhelming frustration, the humiliated Quill glares downward as a fierce resolve ignites within his narrowed eyes. A comforting, gentle presence attempts to shield the trembling boy, softly urging Quill that he absolutely does not need to listen. Pushed to the absolute psychological brink, a defiant inner voice surges forward with a reckless determination to prove his tormentors wrong. Trudging alone through the unforgiving Noxera Mountains, a desperate Quill grips a map and mutters that he must quickly find a magical beast. Suddenly halting his tense trek, the young boy gasps in absolute shock as an ominous, violent rustling from the deep brush seizes his attention. Emerging directly from the dark shadows, a nightmarish, skeletal beast with rotting flesh reveals its horrific, blood-curdling visage. Thrusting a desperate, trembling hand forward, a terrified Quill screams as the grotesque, horned monstrosity lunges directly at his face. A devastating physical blow strikes the young boy, violently launching his small frame backwards through the air with brutal, bone-jarring force. Slumped bleeding and broken against a massive tree trunk, Quill weakly raises a trembling hand to fend off the deadly beast looming over him. Cornered helplessly against the rough bark, Quill violently squeezes his eyes shut as the monstrous horse exhales foul breath into his battered face. A sudden, blinding blur of violent speed lines completely cuts through the thick forest canopy, indicating a massive, incredibly swift physical impact. Opening his deeply bloodshot eyes, an astounded Quill stares directly forward as a sudden intervention violently splatters hot blood across the trees. Drenched in a sudden spray of horrifying gore, Quill watches in paralyzed awe as the terrifying beast's severed head tumbles through the air. Splattered completely with fresh blood across his pale cheeks, the deeply traumatized boy stares straight forward with wide eyes at his miraculous savior. Overwhelmed entirely by the sheer visceral horror of the brutal execution, Quill desperately covers his tear-filled face with his blood-soaked hands. Standing victorious in the sunlit clearing, imposing knights clad in striking black uniforms confidently sheath their swords around the decapitated beast. Shifting to a highly somber bedroom scene, a doctor examines a comatose, grown Quill while gravely murmuring that his eyes might not ever open. Sitting dutifully by the peaceful, quiet bedside, a devoted young woman carefully reads a heavy tome aloud to the highly unresponsive young man. A profound, heavy silence completely fills the opulent room as the crushing weight of Quill's prolonged, mysterious slumber hangs thickly in the air. Breaking the agonizingly long silence, a sudden, pained groan escapes from the very depths of the young man's throat as his consciousness returns. Peering through his slowly fluttering eyelids, a blurry vision of the anxious woman comes into focus alongside his weak, painful gasps. Weeping absolute tears of joy, the emotional woman leans over the bed and cries out his name, desperately confirming that Quill can finally see. Fully awake at long last, Quill's striking amber eyes widen with a deep mix of profound shock and quiet realization as he looks past her shoulder. A solemn, commanding voiceover explains the grave duty of a Black Knight to protect the kingdom from magical beasts during the gap in the blessing. Staring straight ahead with steely determination, Quill listens as a stern voice questions if he wishes to become a Black Knight despite his past. Captured in a striking profile, Quill courageously embraces his dark destiny despite bearing the blood of a fallen kingdom and tainted blood. Expressing deep concern for Olga, a distressed voice strongly opposes Quill's dangerous decision to become a Black Knight. Burdened by heavy guilt, Quill grimly reflects that it would be better if he simply left House Langbart altogether. Validating his painful struggles, a supportive figure assures Quill they understand his feelings and will not hold him back. With a resolute and steady gaze, the older figure firmly commands Quill to remember their solemn supportive promise. Slowly stirring from a deep slumber, the young man begins to shift restlessly beneath his warm bed covers. Blinking heavily against the morning light, Quill groggily rubs his weary eyes as he awakens in his quiet room. Stretching his stiff limbs with a soft yawn, the sleepy knight finally throws off the heavy blankets to start his day. Sitting upright in his large bed, a thoughtful Quill quietly murmurs that he just had quite a nostalgic dream. Stepping out onto the cold stone floor, the young warrior gazes out the window as the morning sun washes over him. Gently interrupting his quiet morning solitude, an attentive maid softly calls out to Lord Quill from the open doorway. Quickly shifting into his daily routine, the young captain efficiently dresses himself while preparing for the day's heavy duties. Turning to face his loyal attendant, a fully dressed Quill politely wishes the polite young woman a good morning. Striding purposefully down the brightly lit corridor, the young lord announces he is heading straight to the dining hall. Suddenly stopping dead in his tracks, a look of profound realization flashes across his stoic and handsome face. Pinching the bridge of his nose in sheer frustration, a deeply exasperated Quill mutters that he has really done it now. Pushing through his lingering embarrassment, the young knight hastily marches down the hallway with a tense and rigid posture. Pausing briefly to collect his scattered thoughts, Quill nervously begins to explain that his recent actions were because of that specific incident. Admitting his sudden and cowardly departure, a deeply ashamed Quill confesses that he simply ran away from the situation. Reflecting on his foolish and impulsive retreat, the young captain sheepishly acknowledges that his past behavior was exceedingly childish. Rejecting the notion of idle curiosity, a sharp-eyed companion states they understand his complex reasoning even less now. Questioning his own dubious worth, Quill suggests choosing a white knight of certain pedigree would reassure Count Carries much more. Staring deeply into his uncertain eyes, a gentle voice insists that only the Saintess herself would truly understand that heart. Shocking the young captain, a comrade reveals that today's standard training has suddenly been turned into a court exhibition match. Explaining the rising political tension, the companion notes the white knights feel their pride wounded by his engagement to the Saintess. Grasping the volatile situation, a stoic Quill silently listens as he learns they demanded a joint black and white exhibition match. Questioning their shallow pride, Quill discovers his opponent will be the supposedly endearing Sir Marius in the upcoming public duel. Narrowing his sharp amber eyes, the young captain coldly deduces that Marius merely wishes to defeat him before a massive crowd. Denying any sense of amusement, Quill is suddenly interrupted by a loud voice enthusiastically shouting for the captain. Turning toward the booming greeting, Quill respectfully welcomes Commander Geiss as the older man loudly announces his arrival. Briefly apologizing for the sudden intrusion, Geiss quickly asks the captain for a moment while Quill insists on training longer. Gesturing toward the courtyard entrance, the towering commander formally announces that the highly anticipated Saintess has finally arrived. Guiding the distinguished guest, an informative Geiss points out the swordsmanship grounds and the magic area protected by heavy spells. Discussing the raw power of nature, the commander eagerly confirms to the observant Saintess that they actively practice modern magic here. Proudly detailing their combat abilities, Geiss boasts of his own fire affinity while noting that Quill possesses an affinity for ice. Praising the young captain's legendary defensive skills, the commander reveals Quill is famously known as the impregnable ice wall. Chuckling at Quill's stubbornness, an amused Geiss loudly jokes that the captain is entirely hopeless when it comes to any romance. Quickly backtracking his highly inappropriate joke, the flustered commander stammers that Quill is just unbreakable and strong like ice. Highlighting their diverse backgrounds, Geiss proudly explains that the Black Knights welcome all sorts regardless of their magical lineage. Smiling warmly at the grand tour, the graceful Saintess remarks that Lord Quill truly works in a remarkably fine place. Standing tall with quiet dignity, the legendary impregnable ice wall silently prepares himself for the impending, highly politicized exhibition match. Reminiscing on grim warfare, a grave voice notes that simple theory does not always translate to actual battle. Plunging into dark history, the narrator reveals that magical beasts surged in when the blessing was severed after the previous Saintess passed away. Highlighting the chaotic reality of combat, a somber reflection admits that the unexpected happens with terrifying ease. Surveying the grim aftermath, the narrator explains that some knights were discharged due to injuries sustained during the gap in the blessing. Recognizing the bonds of brotherhood, a veteran observes that there are still those who faithfully watch over their juniors. Mourning the inevitable tragedies, the voice suggests that regret would vanish if the protective star descended quickly. Observing a moment of heavy silence, the narrative pauses on a solemn beat as the profound weight of the kingdom's regret lingers. Discussing political strategies, Lord Zasha notes His Majesty is heavily considering whether ancient magic can successfully deal with the beasts. Suddenly interrupting the intense tactical discussion, a deeply apologetic Quill arrives late to the imposing gathering. A tense, quiet moment completely engulfs the grand corridor as the newly arrived captain locks eyes with his unexpected audience. Excusing himself from the gathering, a noble states he shall go see how the First Division is currently doing. Bowing her head gracefully, Carries politely thanks Lord Barchet for safely guiding her through the vast military compound. Waving a dismissive hand, the departing noble teasingly bids farewell to the Saintess and her highly flustered Lord Fiancé. Standing entirely alone in the massive stone hallway, a heavy and completely silent tension stretches between the newly engaged couple. Breaking the suffocating silence, a stern Quill sharply questions why Miss Carries would come to such a dangerous place alone. Gazing up with feigned vulnerability, the delicate Saintess confesses she feared Lord Quill might not return to the townhouse. Softening his harsh tone slightly, the duty-bound knight solemnly promises he will return so they can speak after his work. Challenging his sudden reassurance, Carries fiercely points out that he appeared too angered to even look upon her face this morning. Stumbling over his usually composed words, a deeply flustered Quill stammers incoherently under her intense, piercing scrutiny. Bowing his head in deep shame, the young captain admits he behaved poorly and swears he will certainly return to the townhouse. Narrowing her striking eyes with sudden intensity, Carries boldly accuses the towering knight of telling a blatant lie. Desperately defending his honor, Quill formally explains he was simply unable to grasp the proper distance between them. Stepping aggressively into his personal space, Carries violently fixates her intense gaze directly upon his trembling left hand. Reaching out with breathtaking speed, the Saintess firmly grasps that left hand bearing the heavy, symbolic oath ring. Jolting completely backward in sheer shock, the impregnable ice wall visibly shatters under the sudden and intimate physical contact. Flashing a wicked, triumphant smirk, Carries playfully asks if he was surprised while declaring she would not disrupt his duties for personal matters. Dropping her vulnerable facade completely, the cunning Saintess flatly admits she lied using the former Saintess's words. Staring down at his mischievous fiancé in absolute silence, Quill processes the sheer audacity of her clever emotional manipulation. Leaning forward with a dazzling, unrepentant smile, Carries once again playfully asks the stunned captain if he was surprised. Releasing a deep, heavy sigh of utter defeat, Quill concedes her victory and notes she seems rather fond of mischief. Blinking in sudden contemplation, the playful Saintess pauses as the emotional weight of the conversation drastically shifts. Whispering the word fond softly to herself, Carries peers downward as a sudden wave of confusing, nostalgic melancholy washes over her. Questioning her own fragmented memories, the quiet girl wonders if she truly was fond of mischief since she cannot confirm it now. Shaking off the fleeting sadness, Carries brightens up and warmly states she is very glad she was able to surprise him. Placing a trembling hand over his chest, an exhausted Quill readily admits her little trick did quite a number on his heart. Shifting suddenly to a highly serious tone, Carries formally addresses Lord Quill regarding an important matter she wishes to ask. Revealing the White Knight's invitation, the Saintess directly asks if it would trouble him if she attended the exhibition match as a spectator. Regaining his stoic composure, Quill calmly states he does not mind before a sudden voice violently interrupts his sentence. Bursting excitedly onto the scene, A loud voice triumphantly declares they have finally found where the Saintess was hiding. Whirling around in utter surprise, Carys visibly reacts toward the sudden intrusion as the quiet corridor erupts into chaos. Introducing the striking commander, Marius stands tall as the captain of the 1st Division of the White Knights and the eldest son of the Marquis. Highlighting his prestigious background, the narrative reveals that this elite knight served faithfully as captain of the guard during the Saintess's sacred pilgrimage. Turning with a sudden and sharp motion, the handsome knight casts an intense and completely unyielding glare toward the grand corridor. Striding forward with absolute confidence, Marius physically imposes his powerful presence upon the quiet scene. Pausing gracefully in her tracks, a beautifully adorned Carys casts a gentle glance back over her delicate shoulder. Bowing respectfully, an earnest Marius declares he still considers himself her guard while Carys politely asks him to stop since she is no longer the Saintess. Offering his noble services, Marius firmly insists on escorting her to the arena while Carys gently commands him to wait. Standing her ground with quiet dignity, the former Saintess explains that she is currently in the process of obtaining Lord Quill's permission to spectate. Narrowing his eyes with deep offense, the proud White Knight sharply retorts that such permission from another man is completely unnecessary. Stepping dangerously close, an intense Marius stares downward and aggressively questions if Carys truly chose this man of her own free will. Raising her hand to display the solemn oath ring, Carys firmly confirms that she was the one who made the engagement request. Staring in absolute horror at the jewelry, the devastated White Knight recoils as if physically struck by the undeniable proof. Boiling with uncontrollable rage, Marius furiously curses the scoundrel for daring to bind the former Saintess with such a cheap oath ring. Clenching his gloved fists with trembling fury, the enraged knight completely loses his normally pristine aristocratic composure. Glaring viciously at the modest ring, Marius fiercely declares that the pathetic engagement is absolutely no good. Interrupting the fiery tirade, a stoic Quill steps forward to calmly assert that he does not recall deceiving anyone at all. Meeting the White Knight's furious gaze with cold indifference, Quill stands tall and completely unfazed by the aggressive hostility. Exploding with righteous indignation, Marius fiercely demands how Quill dares speak so boldly after being chosen by the Saintess. Hurling a deeply racist insult, Marius maliciously calls Quill a red-eyed Betseraft wretch before Carys desperately begs him to stop. Intervening forcefully, Carys firmly reveals that she used her Saintess title to ask Princess Consort Juliana for support because this engagement was her own wish. Shocked by the royal involvement, a stunned Marius gasps at Her Highness's name as Carys bluntly insists that she was the one who pushed for it. Desperately trying to break the bond, Marius warns the Saintess that Quill is not the true son of House Langbart. Cutting him off with absolute certainty, an unwavering Carys fiercely declares that she already knows far more about Lord Quill than Marius ever will. Gritting his teeth in ultimate frustration, the humiliated White Knight violently recoils as his arrogant warnings are completely shut down. Directing his lethal wrath entirely toward his rival, Marius aggressively commands the Dark Knight to prepare for their upcoming match. Vowing absolute public humiliation, the furious noble promises to show the Saintess the pathetic sight of Quill kneeling on one knee. Turning his back with a dramatic swirl of his cape, Marius silently swears to himself that he will make the Saintess finally come to her senses. Marching angrily down the grand stone corridor, the seething White Knight repeats his dark vow to shatter their engagement by force. Watching his hostile rival depart in complete silence, Quill maintains his impenetrable and icy expression without a single hint of fear. Turning toward her surprisingly silent fiancé, a deeply confused Carys questions what Quill possibly intends to accomplish by provoking the noble. Sighing with weary resignation, Quill plainly states that this treatment is nothing new and she may let them say whatever they like about him. Reacting to his tragic acceptance of abuse, the delicate Saintess suddenly lowers her gaze as a dark and protective fury begins to bubble within her. Trembling with a quiet but terrifying rage, Carys clenches her small fists tightly as she processes the horrific slurs thrown at her partner. Breaking the heavy silence with chilling flatness, the fiercely protective Saintess directly references how Lord Klassen just maliciously called him red-eyed. Looking up with absolute and unwavering conviction, Carys fiercely corrects the bigoted insult by firmly declaring that Quill's eyes are actually amber. Caught entirely off guard by her fierce and sudden defense, a wide-eyed Quill softly murmurs her name in profound shock. Pouting slightly with adorable yet fierce determination, Carrie stares directly into his striking eyes to completely validate his true identity. Softening her intense expression into a gentle gaze, the devoted Saintess warmly repeats the word amber while demanding his agreement. Completely disarmed by her profound acceptance, the towering impregnable ice wall stands utterly frozen by the sheer warmth of her words. Basking in the quiet intimacy of the empty corridor, the newly engaged couple shares a deeply poignant moment of mutual respect and growing affection. Tension fills the air as the combatants square off in the grand arena. A fierce silence descends over the cheering crowd before the impending physical confrontation. Questioning a hazy memory, someone wonders why a stranger would recognize his amber eyes. Stepping forward with quiet authority, an imposing figure interrupts the tense exchange, declaring her absolute dominance. She decrees that if the Saintess claims Quill's eyes are amber, they are undeniably amber. Demanding unwavering loyalty, she sharply interrogates the warrior about the identity of his true fiancé. Standing his ground, Quill proudly affirms that he belongs solely to Miss Carries. Reminding him of his sacred duty, she emphasizes his prestigious role as the guardian and fiancé of Saintess Lynetta Carries. She boldly proclaims that the Saintess's chosen guardian should effortlessly brush aside the air of a marquis. Admitting his personal distaste for Lord Klassen, he concedes his irritation just as the countdown begins. Energy surges across the battleground as a sudden shift in stance signals the start of the brutal fight. Blades gleam under the blinding arena lights as the warriors launch into a dazzling display of speed. Wishing him absolute victory, Lynetta calls out to Quill with unshakable faith. A thunderous shockwave ripples through the stadium as the fighters clash with earth-shattering power. Spectators gasp in pure awe at the overwhelming physical strength displayed in the center ring. Challenging aristocratic traditions, the crowd wonders if the Saintess's fiancé can casually shatter the unspoken rule of yielding to a marquis's house. Pushing beyond mortal limits, an awe-inspiring presence challenges him to forge his very fate into a lethal weapon. Dust clears from the shattered arena floor to reveal a relentless struggle between the mighty combatants. A masterful parry sends a shockwave of brute force rippling out toward the cheering audience. Squaring his broad shoulders, the warrior prepares to unleash a devastating counterattack. A sudden, blinding movement cuts completely through the heavy tension of the battlefield. Fueled by blazing determination, Quill vows to answer Miss Carries' heartfelt encouragement with a resounding triumph. A powerful strike reverberates across the massive grounds as the duel rapidly intensifies. Gripping his weapon tightly, the swordsman braces his body for a monumental impact. Realizing the absolute truth, a spectator notes the massive crowd gathered solely to witness the legendary might of the Saintess's fiancé. Shocked by the sheer volume of attendees, an onlooker finally registers the violently overflowing stadium. Questioning his usual passive strategy, someone wonders if he will simply let Lord Klassen win again. The overwhelming pressure of the match leaves the surrounding challengers hesitating in their tracks. Shattering all expectations, he coldly declares that throwing the match will no longer be possible. A sharp hiss of displaced air escapes as the combatants lock blades in a ferocious bind. Breaking the deadly deadlock, a sudden burst of speed leaves the audience completely breathless. Humming in quiet approval, an observer watches the flawless execution of a perfect defensive stance. Shifting her attention smoothly, a royal observer gently calls out to Lady Lynetta. Seeking her vital insight, the companion asks Lynetta for her honest thoughts on the spectacular arena battles. Noting Her Highness's tightly clenched fists, the observer points out the undeniable exhilaration sweeping through the entire audience. The roaring cheers of the massive crowd wash over the royal seating area as the fight reaches its peak. Acknowledging Lynetta's rapt attention, the observer praises this rare and thrilling opportunity to witness such masterful knightly swordsmanship. Blushing slightly, Lynetta asks if her intense focus was unseemly, only to be warmly reassured by her companion. Encouraging her to fully revel in the moment, the companion assures Lady Lynetta that Quill's breathtaking swordsmanship is absolutely worth witnessing. Watching with breathless anticipation, she silently calls out Quill's name as the epic, earth-shaking duel continues. Questioning the royal's connection, a curious companion asks if His Highness is already intimately acquainted with the knight Quill. Apologizing for the sudden oversight, the royal realizes he completely forgot to mention their deeply intertwined history. Revealing an unbreakable bond, the royal explains that he and Quill are childhood friends because Quill's birth mother, Lady Olga, once saved both his and Lars's lives. Astonished by the heavy revelation, The listener repeats in sheer disbelief that Olga actually saved the royal's life. Confirming her humble origins, they acknowledge that Lady Olga originally hailed from the distant land of Betsaraft. Reflecting on the turbulent past, the companion notes that Lady Langbart graciously took in both Olga and a young Quill. Settling into a brand new life, Olga resided safely with the noble family and served humbly as a dedicated maid. A somber truth hangs heavily in the air as it is revealed she tragically passed away just 2 short years later. Remembering the devastating loss, they note it has been 20 long years since Quill was left motherless at only 5 years old. Gazing down at the sprawling arena floor, the observers reflect silently on the heavy and inescapable weight of the past. Realizing he became hopelessly sidetracked, the royal formally admits he has delayed discussing the most critical matter at hand. Drowning in warm nostalgia, he vividly recalls the precious and fleeting times the three of them spent together with Lady Olga. Explaining his deep personal ties to the noble house, he mentions Count Langbart was the strict director of the royal library entrusted with his education. Acknowledging his massive lifelong debt to the family, His Highness shares a quiet moment of absolute understanding with Lynetta. Shifting their intense focus to the battlefield, they notice the highly anticipated and brutal duel is finally about to begin. Stepping confidently into the center ring, a heavily armored knight fiercely readies his gleaming weapon for lethal combat. Setting the strict arena rules, the announcer declares a purely physical clash where the first unavoidable strike immediately claims absolute victory. Accepting the brutal and unforgiving terms, the combatant gives a firm and silent nod of absolute understanding. Demanding absolute fairness from Marquis Kirsten, the crowd insists on an impartial judgment despite the challenger's infamous status as a Black Knight. Accepting the incredibly heavy responsibility, the Marquis confidently guarantees a perfectly fair and honorable match. Facing off under the blinding Colosseum lights, the two elite swordsmen lock eyes in tense and terrifying anticipation. The explosive and thunderous command to begin instantly shatters the breathless silence of the massive arena. Bursting forward with blinding speed, the challenger launches a ferocious and unpredictable opening assault. Analyzing the incoming deadly trajectory, the defender expertly notes the powerful strike is coming directly from the right. Sparks violently erupt into the air as cold steel meets heavy armor in a thunderous and earth-shaking opening clash. Tracking the enemy's chaotic rhythm flawlessly, the defender prepares his body for the inevitable second move. Anticipating the highly predictable sequence of attacks, a calculated counter-strategy quickly forms in the seasoned warrior's mind. Predicting the exact flow of the fierce combat, he expects his opponent to instinctively create defensive distance by the fourth move. Relying heavily on familiar patterns, the warrior foolishly assumes this bloody duel will play out exactly like all the others. Shattering all tactical expectations, a sudden and aggressive shift in momentum catches the defender completely off guard. Pressing the terrifyingly intense attack, the challenger fiercely drives his heavy blade forward with lethal precision. A deafening metallic clang rings out as a desperate, last-second parry barely deflects the devastating killing blow. Furious at the highly unexpected aggression, the heavily armored knight aggressively demands to know the meaning behind this fierce assault. Smiling wickedly through the intense clash, his opponent openly admits that fighting before the SAINTESS has wildly stirred his bloodthirsty spirit. Recognizing the swirling elemental energy, an observer gasps in horror as illicit wind magic suddenly envelopes the entire arena floor. Analyzing the illegal magical surge, a spectator critically notes the rather simplistic yet incredibly effective application of the forbidden spell. Offering a highly condescending and mocking apology, the arrogant fighter boldly permits his cornered opponent a single free strike. Refusing to ever lose his cool under pressure, the seasoned warrior completely dismisses the incredibly cheap and pathetic provocation. Gripping his heavy blade tightly, Quill confidently shifts his unwavering and intense gaze toward the towering royal seating area. Stunned by his sudden and confusing shift in focus, an opponent watches helplessly as Quill searches the massive crowd solely for miscarries. Staring intently across the arena floor, Quill firmly readies his defensive stance for the incoming clash. Blades collide with blinding speed as the two heavily armored knights exchange a furious flurry of blows. Expertly deflecting a vicious overhead strike, the dark-haired swordsman smoothly pivots his agile body away from danger. Swift footwork allows him to narrowly escape the crushing and lethal arc of his enraged opponent's weapon. Confirming his absolute control over the fierce duel, Quill calmly notes that there is no issue at all. Thrusting his heavy blade forward in a wild assault, Lord Marius tries frantically to shatter the impregnable defense. Taunting his completely flustered opponent, Quill casually asks what is wrong as he effortlessly dodges yet another clumsy swing. Slashing violently through thin air, Marius grows increasingly frustrated by his pathetic inability to land a single hit. Spinning gracefully amidst the deadly chaos, Quill seamlessly positions himself for a devastating and unavoidable counterattack. The cold steel of his gleaming sword flashes dangerously as he completely corners his arrogant aristocratic foe. A blood-curdling yell tears from Marius's throat as he recklessly launches one final and totally desperate charge. Sparks violently erupt high into the roaring arena air as their massive weapons grind furiously against each other. Bearing down with overwhelming physical power, Quill easily forces the struggling Marquis's heir completely onto his back foot. Clicking his tongue in boiling irritation, Marius glares venomously at his untouchable and incredibly frustrating adversary. Accusing him bitterly of pure cowardice, the White Knight furiously screams that Quill does absolutely nothing but evade. Demanding an honorable fight, the enraged nobleman violently orders his opponent not to mock a White Knight's sacred blade. Denying the hypocritical accusation smoothly, Quill calmly points out that Marius is actually the one currently making a mockery of things. Boiling over with completely uncontrollable rage, Marius viciously spits out a vile slur by calling Quill a red-eyed wretch. Stopping completely dead in his tracks, a terrifying and icy stillness washes instantly over the dark-haired guardian. Stepping menacingly forward, Quill coldly declares that Miss Carey's absolutely despises that specific word. Blurring completely out of sight, he instantly launches a terrifyingly fast and utterly inescapable strike against the noble. A blinding and explosive flash of steel instantly shatters Marius's fragile guard and violently disarms him in one fluid motion. The earth-shattering force of the flawless attack violently knocks the haughty nobleman straight down into the dirt. Collapsing pathetically in a heap of battered armor, the White Knight stares up in sheer and unadulterated disbelief. Looming darkly like an inescapable shadow, Quill points his lethal blade directly at the fallen heir's exposed throat. Absolute and terrified silence violently grips the colossal arena as the terrifying victor officially cements his total combat dominance. Glaring coldly down with merciless ruby eyes, the undefeated guardian seals the crushing and utterly humiliating defeat. Warning him softly but with pure lethal intent, Quill ominously advises the trembling nobleman to remember that painful lesson well. Sliding his gleaming weapon flawlessly back into its scabbard, he abruptly and coldly turns his broad back on his conquered foe. A stunned gasp ripples through the massive stadium before absolutely deafening cheers suddenly erupt into the sky. The announcer's booming voice echoes across the grand arena to officially declare Quill Langbart the absolute victor. Panicking slightly in the stands, an anxious onlooker questions if completely humiliating Chancellor Classen's son is truly acceptable.